We're going to talk today about how to think functionally about students who have anxious behaviors. And these are your objectives. You're going to be able to describe how to think functionally and maybe start selecting some strategies based on the function and the events surrounding anxious behaviors. So we're going to talk about basically students with anxiety. I know that some of you are attending this webinar today or this chat because you're seeing an increase in a lot of students who appear to be more anxious. And you're correct. It is one of the most common mental health issues that we do see according to the National Institute of Mental Health. And you can see that it's a few years old, but that there was about a quarter, 25% of 13 to 18-year-olds have an anxiety disorder, with 5.9% of them having one that is considered severe. And there's several types of disorders that fall under anxiety. So you can see it could be generalized anxiety disorder, which basically you're worried about everything. There are some adults I know who are kind of like that as well. And then the post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, and specific phobias like social phobias. A lot of students who have anxiety disorders will also have co-occurring mental health issues, so not that which exacerbates it, because it's not just anxiety, but there's other things. For example, depression, maybe a lot of kids with, for example, autism spectrum disorders also have co-occurring anxiety disorders that are not part of their autism diagnosis or identification. We do know that kids who have mental health issues overall don't get the treatment that they need. But specifically when we look at anxiety, we have a lot of kids who are not getting the supports and services compared to children who have more externalizing problems. And what's happened, thank you, Karen, for fixing our line for us, for doing whatever we need to do, which is, I'm sure there's animations of this that I'm forgetting to do because it's being done in a different format, so standing in front of all of you. One of the things that you probably are aware of, even more so in the last few years, is most kids who are getting any mental health supports are kind of getting them primarily through schools. You guys have become the default source of mental health delivery. And well, in a way, that's good. We can have some advantages. That also makes some challenges for many school districts, because being able to have the expertise on what kind of evidence-based interventions are there, specifically for students who have anxiety disorders. So are we seeing more students with anxiety, and why? All of these things that are floating up here are things that can increase and enhance the prevalence of students with anxiety. It's just having poor physical health, either with the student with anxiety or the parents, poverty, family dysfunction, marital discord. We're seeing more abuse and neglect. This is resulting in some school failure. School failure in and of itself can cause anxiety. Parents not having a lot of education or expertise or background, sometimes coercive discipline, ineffective parenting, peer socialization. And with our peers today, with the social media and all the pressure that comes from not just face-to-face kind of issues, but the ongoing prevalence of social media is a big source of anxiety. Not having adults in their lives. And also, as they say, sometimes the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. A lot of parents have a source of mental illness that they may either genetically passed on to their child or just impacts their child having some anxiety disorder. So you are seeing a lot more of children with anxiety disorders. So you're required to understand the condition a lot more and provide evidence-based interventions. There are such a diverse array of symptoms and behaviors that you would see with children who have anxiety. And so there's the children who have generalized anxiety, which is they're always worrying. You know, there's always a frown or a furrow on their forehead, and they are constantly worrying about everything. You may start seeing some of the students who have very somatic complaints, particularly when an anxiety condition or situation is present. They'll start complaining they have headaches and stomach aches. Guy actually in 2004 thinks that actual complaint may actually be more frequent of anxiety in students of color. So students who are Black or students who are Latino. You might see flushed cheeks and tense muscles. You might see intense social phobias that result in them not doing any activities. A lot of common activities are if there's a party that's scheduled or if there's an extracurricular activity that they're going to be going to that day. Specific phobias as well could be some kids are afraid of the dark, or they're afraid of dogs, or they're afraid to get up and talk in front of people. And then some students you will see will have some obsessive compulsions. They're unable to stop worrying, and they're going to do some compulsive behavior that's routine to hopefully get them some soothing ability to control the situation. So what are the effects of anxiety symptoms? Big one is poor academic achievement. So when you think about if you guys, any of you on this chat are ever in an anxious state, the anxiety takes so much energy away from you that it's hard to concentrate on your job. So if you can imagine a child who is anxious and is extremely concerned or has a phobia or is worried about something that's going to be happening in the future, they have very little energy to put forth on their academic tasks that you're trying to hopefully get them to do. This can definitely impair their relationships with their peers. They often are kids who may isolate themselves or have some difficulty building relationships. Sometimes children with anxious behaviors, even though it is considered an internalizing condition, might show behaviors that teachers will misinterpret as externalizing behavior. So we have some kids who will become non-compliant, and their non-compliant may look like an externalizing behavior, but the non-compliance is a result of being anxious. So they may refuse to do schoolwork. They may call you some names or do some cursing. And it's not because they are just willfully saying, I don't want to do this work, but it could be impacted because they're in an anxious state or there is an environmental event present that is making them anxious. So often kids might go unrecognized by educators, and sometimes this is because anxiety has a very erratic nature to it. So the example of this, and some of you will know some of this child very well. Monday, Stephanie breaks her pencil, and no problem. She just asks the teacher for another pencil. On Tuesday, she breaks her pencil again. She just decides to go sharpen it. Wednesday, she breaks her pencil, and all of a sudden she screams, cries, and runs out of the room over a pencil. That outburst on Wednesday may have nothing to do with the pencil breaking or very little to do with the pencil breaking, but there might be something in her life or her day or the night before, or even earlier in the period before the pencil breaking in school that has caused her to come in either to school in an anxious state or result in an anxious state. And so we sometimes say this is a hidden disability, and there are some experts in the field who kind of compare it to you never know when the soda can has been shook, and when you open it, it will go all over you, or it was some time ago it was shook and the anxious situation is all finished, and now it's safe to open that soda can. So let's now talk about what do you do for functional behavior assessments and then develop interventions for anxiety. So why do we even do FBA BIPs for students with anxiety? Well, first, it may not look exactly like the FBA you would do for a child who has the typical externalizing behavior, the ones who you can very much hear and see those behaviors, count them. And those are the typical FBA processes that have been shown to be very effective. But what an FBA could do for students with anxiety, and you don't even have to do a formal FBA, this may be sitting together and interviewing and talking to the student and the parents and trying to look for patterns to understand what context or what environmental conditions or what kind of other things might be happening in that child's life that can help you predict today's going to be a day when the anxiety behaviors are going to be present. By being able to predict when anxiety is going to occur, it helps you prevent it, help the child recognize and then learn to use replacement behaviors or cognitive behavioral therapy strategies that can self-regulate and calm them down, and to perform when this anxiety is present, and then be able to get natural reinforcement, which would be a soothing of the anxiety, as well as maybe get what their function is, whether it is I want to escape this situation that's making me really anxious, or I am able to access some attention and self-soothing activities. So one of the things that's more important in students with anxiety is to identify if they're setting events. And just a refresher for setting events. The trigger, those of you that are familiar with FBAs, the trigger is the antecedent. That's a real long word for just something immediately pushes the student to do a problem behavior. So things like, for a lot of kids with externalizing behavior problems, you ask them to do something they don't want to do that is either difficult, hard, boring, or they just don't like it that day. That's going to be an immediate trigger to doing behaviors such as saying, I don't want to do it, you can't make me do it. We have a lot of kids who like to say, you can't make me do that. Setting events typically happen a little bit delayed. It could be a couple of hours before you give the immediate trigger, or it could even be a day or 2 days. And for some students with anxious behaviors, it can be something that they're setting up a chain that a week ago you give an assignment that makes them anxious. For example, they have to do a book report in front of the class, and getting in front of the class sets off a really anxious situation. Their anxiety may start, and they may start worrying about this event the week before, or even for some students in high school in the semester, they look at the syllabus and they see there's a couple of talks coming, and they're going to start getting a little bit anxious. So these setting events are things that happen a little bit removed in time, but it sets that chain up. So setting events are not the setting. I know that's confusing because the word setting is in setting event. Why do we call it a setting event when it's not the setting, right? It is not the setting, though. Trust me. We have some articles that we could refer to you if you really want to know more about these. It's also not something that's present every day. Sometimes I work with teams and they say, well, medication's a setting event. Well, if they take their medication every single day, then it's not going to be any different one day from another unless medication changes or they miss medication. Perhaps that's a setting event. It really is something that on the days when this event is present, those are the days you're going to see more problem behavior or more of the target behavior, or you may see it in a more intense, frequent mode. So how does setting events work? There's a lot I know on this slide, sorry for that. Mm-hmm. But it does have a delayed impact on the behavior, and how it really works, speaking as a behavior analyst in a very layman way, is a setting event will make whatever is typically pleasurable or reinforcing no longer the reinforcer that day. It changes the value. So here's an example. Susan's a real quiet girl. Most days she follows her directions. She stays engaged. She has a class assignment that Thursday that will require her to get up in front of the class and give an oral report. Okay, she's been worrying about this all week. She goes home. She complains that she's feeling sick. She's coming down with something for a lot of days. Wednesday night, again, Thursday morning, she tries to get her parents to let her stay home because she doesn't feel well. Of course, her parents are wise to her, and they send her to school and tell her that if she gives her report, because they do know she gets anxious, she's going to earn a trip to Disney World on Saturday. It's her most favorite place in the world, right? So typically a very reinforcing event. When she arrives at school, she starts talking about, I don't feel well. About a half hour before her class is scheduled to give the reports, the teacher says, oh boy, I hope everybody's ready for this report. I'm really excited about it. I'm going to give you a little bit of extra time to prepare so you're ready. At this point, she starts sweating. She gets a dry mouth. She becomes dizzy. She tells the teacher she doesn't feel well. She goes to the nurse. Then she goes to the nurse after she asks, and she doesn't give her report. So in your chat box, we're going to test you out here. Mm-hmm. What is the setting event? And first put that in. We'll be able to see if you guys get it in my very brief explanation of setting events. You can just type it in, what you think it is.
Okay. Thank you, Collier.
Yay, that's good. We can give Collier a trip to Disney World. No. I wish.
Susan is sick.
Okay, so perhaps my explanation is a little tougher, so I won't make you do that because some of you may be multitasking anyways. So the setting event of the situation is, think about what is the event that is removed in time but maybe triggering, setting this chain in motion. Because what you said, Collier, that's very good. It's her being sick. That's actually the target behavior that we would define to look at a functional behavior assessment. What is triggering that dry mouth, that the sweats, those not feeling well and asking to go to the doctor. But it's actual that assignment of giving the report. That was done a week ago.
Oh, Tanya got it.
Yay, Tanya, yay. Give her a gold star or a token, whatever token your district uses. So the setting event was the report. And the immediate trigger is it's the day of, and it's the class of, it's a half hour before. And now the teacher is saying we're getting ready to do the reports, right? I'm going to give you some extra time to work on it. So you're going to be ready for it. So it's 30 minutes before the report. That's triggering the really sick feeling. And these are not made up things. With kids with anxiety, that sweat is real. The paleness is real. Everything is real. She has put herself in such an anxious state. She has those physically somatic complaints. The function of Susan's behavior, what do you think it is? Now, that one should be an easier one. The functions are, do you think she's trying to get away or avoid something, or do you think she's trying to get attention? Yep, you got it. So what she's doing is she wants to get out of that situation, which is making her feel really ill, which is giving the report. Now, Disneyland or Disney World isn't strong enough, because right now, that anxious feeling in getting out of having to get in front of that class to give a report is so much more reinforcing and competing with Disney World that that's not going to work for her. So that's the other thing we're talking about now. You guys are probably all doing things with these kids, including trying to give them the tokens, the points, stickers, food. Those typically don't work for kids who have anxiety, because those are based upon when their anxiety is not present. So those could be reinforcing for them on those days. However, when the anxiety is present, whatever is that function of the anxiety competes with those tokens of points. And 9 times out of 10, it's they need to get rid of that sick feeling, that anxious feeling, and that's going to be either by escape or attention, or getting to go home to check on parents, or whatever that anxious situation is. So what we try to do when we do interventions is we try to figure out ways to hopefully prepare the student and do some prevention, but a lot of this will also address how do we replace these anxious symptoms, teach students to recognize those symptoms when they're anxious, and be able to first get their function in a more appropriate way, so they don't have all of this heart palpitation and sweating or the somatic complaints or whatever it is that is their anxious behavior. So maybe ask for a break or for some stress relievers, and the recognition of anxiety by self-regulating, calming themselves, maybe replacing negative thoughts with positive thoughts. Sometimes we teach kids to do little mantras. And then also getting them prepared for some of these, depending on what is making them anxious. Is it actually, for Susan, just talking in front of the class because she's afraid peers will laugh at her? Or is she afraid she might make mistakes in her report? And so maybe getting her prepared and ready in rehearsal. So when we do FBAs for kids with anxiety, we do a lot of the same things that we would do if we were doing an FBA for someone who was doing cursing behavior. We want to define anxious behaviors. Remember that you want to define it as very observable and measurable. What do you actually see the student doing when they're in their anxious state? So don't define it as Susan performs anxious behaviors, because Susan's anxiety and her behaviors might look very different from Bill's anxious behaviors. So the better example would be she reports feeling dizzy and ill. We can see sweat forming on her face and palms. Her complexion turns pale. She asks to see the nurse. We can observe, count, measure every single one of those behaviors. And that will help us answer some questions as well as that maybe ask Susan about them. If there are any precursor behaviors which might happen before the full-on anxiety behaviors occur, it'd be great, because sometimes we can teach kids to start recognizing they're getting anxious, and that's a great way to teach them the replacement behavior. So example of Susan, before she got sweaty, she started shaking her leg, or she started tapping her pencil against a table, and then she gets into the more full-blown anxiety symptoms, and that would be something we might want to also include in our definition. Okay, so I am going to give you a little activity to think about. Think about something that makes you anxious. Describe your behaviors when you're anxious, and maybe define them, and just type them in the chat box. Think of something that makes you anxious. Unless you're one of those free thinking and you just never get anxious about anything, you accept anything that comes your way, you don't have to put anything in the chat box. But it'd be great if a couple of you could put something in the chat box, because there's a lot of things that make us anxious. And see if you can define your behaviors that we would observe if you were anxious about something.
And you had a comment from Vince Kelly also. He said, wouldn't matter if it was $1 million, reward can't overcome anxiety.
You are spot on there. You should be in here doing this. We could have you take over.
Twirling hair, speaking.
Oh, thank you, Collier. Twirling hair, speaking real fast.
Wringing hands.
Yep. You could see, if we had time and a lot of you were putting in behaviors, we would see a whole array of behaviors that are so different. So one of the things you want to think about is when you define the behaviors is maybe observe what you see the student do, what you can actually see, the sweat or the wringing of the hands. All of those are things we can observe. And also asking the student as well. And Karen is going to show you when we talk about cognitive behavior therapy strategies. She's going to show you a couple things to help students identify where in their body they're feeling anxious. Okay, great. Clenched jaw, rapid blinking. Okay, you did great. We'll keep going. So most of the time, how we can get this, you can get some by observations, but this is one that you may have to do an indirect interview, because some of the things happen when you're not there. So some things that happen at the night before or the morning of, you might not be aware, especially things that may not be school related, maybe more family related, that sets them into that anxious state. And so the interview may be the best way to describe the setting events that happen that put that student in that state of getting ready for that chain to be pushed, and they're going to have an anxious situation and an anxiety behaviors. This is where you may also want to really talk with the student. The parents will be able to tell you a lot, but the student may be definitely able to tell you so much more. And then you want to develop by hypothesis. So we're going to show you a couple of examples. So here's an example of Susan's hypothesis. It's a little lengthy, and I could probably have made it a lot more efficient, but I just developed it yesterday or this morning. So this is what you do when you're doing something in a hurry. When an assignment is given that requires Susan to get up in front of people to speak, and the assignment is given at least one day before the activity happens, and within a half hour of the scheduled time of the assignment, Susan will state she's feeling ill, wishes to stay home from school, and when at school on the day of the assignment will complain about dizziness, begin to sweat and become pale in complexion, ask the teacher for permission to see the nurse, and as a result, she gets to avoid the assignment requiring her to get up to speak in front of people. So what we did is we just took that setting event, which is that assignment that's given a couple of days down the road, and then the immediate trigger about a half hour before or so the assignment's ready. That's the immediate trigger. What are the behaviors? Well, we describe the anxious behaviors, and then we hypothesize that what Susan gets out of these anxious behaviors is she gets to avoid or delay doing the task. Here's another guy, Ben. When Ben's parents are out of town and Ben stays with another adult, and when at school he's asked to do non-preferred tasks that are lengthy, or he's required to take a test, he'll put his head down on his desk. As a result, he gets to delay, avoid the non-preferred tasks, and secondarily, he gets attention from the teacher, because the teacher talks a lot, redirects. She may end up sending his work home for homework. Now, do you think that some teachers or educators may think Ben is showing non-compliant behavior instead of behavior that is reflecting how he's manifesting his anxiety? Chat, put your answer whether you think yes or no.
We have a yes.
We have one yes. We have a couple more yeses. Okay, here we go. And that's the issue. And the second question is, we may not have time to have you do this. I'm turning it over to Karen after this slide. However, this often can be what will happen is a teacher will refer Ben to the child study team or to the behavior team, thinking that Ben is being non-compliant. And without doing a really thorough interview and trying to find out, she may not realize, or he may not realize, that Ben's actually manifesting his anxiety about his parents. And it may be because when his parents are out of town, he's concerned something bad's going to happen to them and they're not going to come back home. He watches the news a lot, which he probably shouldn't do. And that's why he doesn't think parents are going to come back. He's afraid something will happen. And so remember we talked about this is exhausting for some kids. They can't devote multitasking both to their anxious behavior and their worries and then doing a task, specifically when it's non-preferred. It's not going to be as motivating to do this task. So these are thinking about what can we do to educate our educators who work with our kids to recognize anxiety and be able to at least hypothesize it could be anxiety. I'm going to turn it over to Karen for the rest of the 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Rose. Okay, so the last question here, though, is just to think about what are some things that we could do that would help teachers to think more about anxiety being the cause maybe of the behaviors that we're seeing, and not just that they are compliance related. And so if anybody has any ideas, you could just put those down in the chat box. But what we know from what Rose spoke to early on is that, you know, upwards of 20% of students can have anxiety related concerns. And so that's 1 in 5. So if our teachers have 20, 25 students, that could be 4 or 5 students in their class that could be experiencing some anxiety concerns and could be misconstrued, the behaviors that they're exhibiting as in other ways if we're not aware of anxiety. So maybe even just sharing the data is one thing so that they can just be aware of the prevalence. Any other ideas, you could just go ahead and type those in, but in the meantime, I'll move forward. All right, so if we've thought some then about the function of the behavior. So we've identified the specific behaviors that the students are exhibiting when they're experiencing anxiety. And we're understanding the function, and very often anxious behaviors result in escape from the thing that they're concerned about. Okay, great. So if a student is, Kathy did respond to our previous question, and so out of the ordinary. So Right, so getting to know our students and knowing what's predictable and typical behavior, and then being able to identify when that behavior is out of the ordinary, because as Rose and the example was about the pencil. So normally if a pencil breaks, it's not upsetting, and then suddenly on a day it is upsetting, well, that's of concern. So if you start to know your students and know what typical behavior is like for them, and you see something then that is really out of the ordinary, then that can be a flag. So just as if you're familiar with our functional behavioral assessments and we've identified the functions of the behaviors, then we use those to then develop intervention plans. And all of our intervention plans are going to start with and have a prevention component. Prevention is going to be a key to almost every intervention for students with anxiety. Is going to be really prevention oriented towards understanding those setting events and trying to do what we can to help to teach. And so in this example, we learned about Ben, and we had a hypothesis for Ben's behavior when his parents were out of town. So this, we restate the hypothesis a little more succinctly here. So when they're out of town and he's asked to do non-preferred tasks, and then he will often put his head down and gets to escape the task, and often also gets attention from the teacher. So the prevention intervention here would be to set up a communication system. So you would know if Ben's parents are going to be out of town, so that you could be prepared to establish some sort of a system that would alert you that he's going to perhaps be in the setting event's going to be occurring. So you want to do some things to preempt the possibility. So limit those kinds of tasks, the non-preferred tasks. So choice is a really nice thing to do, or even interspersing preferred with some non-preferred tasks. So there are a lot of things that you can do in terms of the tasks that are presented to him to help to minimize the likelihood that you'll get the reaction. The amount of time, how that time is divided onto those tasks. And then really monitoring the students so that you start to learn their behaviors too, and you can start to see if the anxiety is going up. And then, so the prevention is going to try to prevent the anxiety from occurring, but then we know that there's a good chance that it might still occur. And in that case, we're going to be working on the replacement behavior. So when we have the hypothesis, so the replacement behavior that we're going to teach are, one, for him to begin to recognize the behaviors he engages in, that his signal that he's beginning to feel anxious, and to ask for escape or a break so that he can have some time either to do an activity or see a counselor. And then we're going to teach him some anxiety reducing strategies. So in this case, it might be something like doing what I'll explain a little bit more later, cognitive behavioral therapy. So sometimes we'll even develop some little cue cards that they can self-talk to themselves that reminds them to keep their thoughts in the correct order in order to keep the anxiety at bay. And so that's what they're going to do here in terms of a replacement behavior. So rather than engaging in the anxious behaviors, they're going to try to either break from them or engage in an alternative behavior that will prevent you from being in those anxious states, like doing something like a stress reliever or positive cognitive activity. Then of course, there's the reinforcement part. So we've prevented, we've also done we're doing some replacement kinds of behaviors, and then working on some reinforcement. So if Ben uses the break or pass when he recognizes he's beginning to feel anxious, we want to reinforce that use of that. And if he uses those anxiety reducing strategies, he uses his cards, he uses his mantra, he uses his relaxation strategy, we want to make sure that he's being reinforced for that. If he's engaging in his task, particularly the non-preferred portions of the tasks, we want to really encourage and reinforce those things. So those were for Ben. Now remember Susan. Susan was the one who had difficulty about getting up and speaking. So let's think about the strategies. Remember that she had been given an assignment and an extended period of time to work on it. And then within a half an hour of the time, when she was supposed to get up and give the speech, she was feeling ill, wanted to go see the nurse. So she got out of doing the assignment and speaking in front of the people. So what are some things that you could do, thinking about what the setting event was, which we said was, the speaking assignment, the immediate trigger, which was, okay, now is the day, you need to get up and do this assignment. The function being that she's going to escape getting up and speaking. And so what kind of a replacement behavior and how could we reinforce? So if you have any ideas for what kinds of things you might do to prevent strategies, what kinds of replacement behaviors we might want to provide or teach Susan, and what kinds of things we want to be reinforcing. I see some people typing, so I'm going to give it just
There's a couple people
minutes.
typing. Kathy.
Okay. Kathy says she could be allowed to present with a partner until she's able to get over her anxiety. That's a really great prevention or even replacement strategy, kind of how to help make the activity a little less aversive by making it a partner kind of activity. She could present, another one with a friend and maybe practice at home. So practice is another really great way to help feel less anxious about the actual presentation. There's not a lot of information here, so we don't know how much support she had in terms of preparing or practice or anything. So it's kind of hard to kind of speak to that. But those are some really great strategies. And someone earlier on had a comment about their own personal had difficulty getting up and speaking, but it became part of their job and they needed to be able to do that. And how is that different from anxiety? And a fear of something and anxiety are very, very similar kinds of ways of describing the same situation. And I'm going to explain a little bit about cognitive behavior therapy. And I think that might help make the link for some people related to that example. So the cognitive model, many of you probably have heard of it. How familiar you are may vary. But the idea is that there's a connection between what we think about when things happen, when there's a situation or something happens, that the way we think about it influences how our emotions about that thing or how we feel, which then influences our behavior. So in this example, so it's cognitive and behavior, right? So you got both the thinking, the cognitive, and the behavior, the actions. So if a teacher tells the student to stop talking and get back to work, then the student's thought is, why is she always picking on me? Everybody else is doing this. And the student's emotion or the way she feels as a result of that is, well, now she's really upset with the teacher. Then what she says, the behavior that the student says is, why are you always picking on me? Riley's talking too. You don't say anything to that person. So it's the relationship between what the student thinks and how they feel about those thoughts that influences the behavior. And another way that you often see the CBT model is in this more circular kind of a model in image, because there's this relationship, because it ends up that our when an action happens, an event happens, and we think about it a certain way and our emotions influence it and our behavior changes, then it just becomes a very connected and an ongoing process. Like if you've ever taken ABC data, you know, it's kind of hard to tell where one sequence ends and the next one starts, because behaviors are connected in sequence. So here's another really, I think, helpful way to think about cognitive behavior therapy. So in general, a typical person, if you have errors in how you're thinking, like I interpret this event wrong, and I have a very strong emotional response to it that's inaccurate, then those strong emotions usually result in some behaviors that end up reducing the intensity of my emotion, because my emotion was out of sync with what just happened. And the effect of it will have is the emotional damping. So my emotions next time won't go as strong when that behavior happens because of the consequences and what happens. So that's the typical process. But when you are someone who's experiencing anxiety, you have an inaccurate way that you assess the situation. And it evokes a very intense emotion in you. And that strong emotion and anxiety and those behaviors result in your wanting to escape or avoid that situation. And then if that's effective and you avoid and escape, and those behaviors help you then to be able to avoid and escape that thing that you inaccurately assessed as a threat, then you're more likely to engage in those behaviors again. So it just reinforces those anxious behaviors and makes it much more likely that next time you're faced with a similar situation, those anxious behaviors are going to be even stronger now, because the outcome, it worked and the behaviors helped you, the function was successful and you were able to escape. So that's how these anxiety behaviors become so strong and embedded in individuals. So it might be helpful to think about it like that. So just to get an idea, how familiar are you with cognitive behavioral therapy? If you're familiar with it, give me a yes in the chat box so I can know of the audience that we have here today, how many people. That's mostly yeses, people familiar, okay. And then are there people in your schools who are familiar with it? So really thinking about, are there people in your schools who kind of understand it and maybe can even use that knowledge?
Renee said, eh?
That's a big leap from are you familiar to can you apply it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so there's a lot of research around cognitive behavior therapy, and it's appropriate for a wide range of individuals. And Rose mentioned that for a lot of students on the autism spectrum, that anxiety can be a co-occurring condition. It's appropriate for a lot of students as an intervention. They have to have a certain level of cognitive and communicative skills in order to be able to really get to their thoughts and behaviors, because it is a cognitive behavior therapy. They have to be open to discussing thoughts and be motivated to change and reach goals and things like that. So but most of the students and that we're dealing with in schools will be appropriate for this type of an intervention. So why should this be a consideration for schools? Well, there's a very good evidence base for using this practice for students with anxiety or individuals in general. It has a really great impact when you do the intervention in its natural context. And school is a place where it's producing a lot of anxiety for students and where students are a lot of time. So it's an opportunity to intervene where students are and where there is a lot of anxiety producing. And it actually can be a lot more affordable than some other kinds of therapies. There are some barriers. Which of the cognitive behavior therapies to use? There are different approaches, but then who can deliver them? Because we want to make sure we're using the evidence-based practice and we're doing it with fidelity by a practitioner who is highly skilled and credentialed to be able to deliver the practice. But what we know from a lot of the research is that when best done in schools, it's done also with universal approaches where teachers are involved. So everybody has some level of skill and knowledge in the practice. So if I have a student and they are dealing with a lot of anxiety and I'm teaching them cognitive and I'm working with them on cognitive behavioral approaches, but I'm a teacher and I'm there in the context when the anxiety is likely to happen and I have no training in how to be able to engage with that student and help them through that process and use those skills, it's not going to work. So the teachers really need to be involved. So there is a training and ongoing support level of resources that could be a little heavy. And just getting people to buy into spending time and resources to do that sometimes that competing initiatives issue. But some things that have been successful, there's some really cool computer-assisted methods that, who doesn't love technology, especially kids, so they'd much rather interact with a machine than a human. So, but working around schedules, really important to involve parents when you can, and there have been some really cool ways of engaging parents through phones and Skypes and using technology to overcome some of those barriers to engaging families and adapting, because maybe the curricula says it should be 60 minutes, but maybe you're able to do it in a couple of, 3 20-minute segments. So people have been able to do that. So another intervention is exposure. So this is a nice little, this is a non-example of exposure. He's going to confront his fears of heights, snakes, and the dark all in one. So this is a controversial technique. Actually, exposure can be a very effective technique. It's a process for facing your fears, but it's not the way it happened in the comic there. It's actually systematic and gradual, and it's very connected to the cognitive behavioral therapy. So exposure is usually interrelated with cognitive behavioral therapy. Usually you don't have exposure that happens without some cognitive behavioral aspects to it connected. In your handout pod, we had a fear ladder and the Facing Your Fears exposure handout. So, and that website that is at the bottom of this slide right here has an amazing number of resources that are very practical, great for teachers, families, on anxiety and other things for students and for adults as well. So I encourage you to check out that resource. So I'll give you some examples, though, of the fear ladder and exposure. So here's a fear pyramid. So here's a ladder, a fear ladder. This is an example for an 11-year-old with a social phobia. So this 11-year-old is not very comfortable, gets very anxious when they have to do things with other people and out in public. So what they do is you make a ladder, and usually there's 10 steps to the ladder, but so with the top of the ladder being the most just awful fear-invoking thing you can imagine, and the bottom being something I think I might be able to do, but it produces some amount of anxiety. And then you kind of, so each step up the ladder is a little more fearful, but building towards that most challenging act at the top. So you could never imagine doing the one at the top, but you might be able to imagine being able to do the one at the bottom. And you work your way up through the fear pyramid and the social, in this kid, it'll be a social phobia ladder until he can successfully engage in without the anxiety. And as I said, it's paired with usually other cognitive behavioral therapy aspects. So Coping Cat is one of the evidence-based practices that incorporate both fear ladders, exposure, as well as cognitive behavior therapy. And it's very, it's up on the list of evidence-based practices, which I also put a list of in your, I'm trying to look for my copy. Evidence-based programs for youth with anxiety, that's in your SharePod. So there are a lot of evidence-based places that you can go to learn about evidence-based practices. And we chose to look at the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, feeling like they have kind of a breadth of material, and they rate from 1 to 3, starting at promising research, and then supported by research evidence, and then well supported by research. So Coping Cat is a well-supported evidence-based practice. So there's a lot of research using randomized controlled trial studies. So you can see all the ones that we have listed and the level of evidence in that file share. So Coping Cat, this gives you an idea. It's for the younger age. There is a similar program called CAT, CAT project, that's for adolescents, but it's at the promising evidence level. Doesn't have quite the level of evidence as this one, but you can see this one helps these students deal with anxiety. They identify, learning first to know when you're anxious, recognizing self-awareness, and then learning when I'm aware that I'm having my coping skills. So that cognitive behavior therapy kind of recognition replacement. And then the fear plan, that's the ladder. So how am I going to move forward in exposure? And there's also a parent component. So making sure that we engage the families in that Coping Cat. So one of the really nice things that happens in this curricula, and this is not from the Coping Cat curriculum, just in case you wondered, is it does help students really begin to identify. They actually have some images where they're looking at a body and they have what things happen physiologically to them when they're anxious. So they begin to really identify, is their heart racing? Are their hands starting to sweat? Are their legs shaking? So they begin to get that body self-awareness in the different mental states, or when they're facing anxiety and when they're feeling calm. So this is just the fear plan from Coping Cat. So they just go through that. What are the situations when they're feeling frightened? They typically are expecting bad things to happen, right? So the idea is to reframe that. Actions and attitudes can help. So that's the cognitive behavioral therapy, identifying kind of the negative self-talk that you had been engaged in and flipping that. And then rewards. So what other interventions are being used for students with anxious behaviors at your school? So I mentioned Coping Cat and some cognitive behavioral therapy. Are there any other curricula that's being used in any of your schools that you'd like to mention here, or? Because we're always interested in what people are using and what people are doing. Okay. All right. Well, so that was kind of a really quick go through of some of the interventions that we have. So we talked some about understanding anxiety and anxious behaviors from a functional standpoint, so thinking about them functionally, and then developing behavior intervention plans that make sense with prevention, replacement behaviors, and reinforcement strategies. And then also thinking about what are some of the other evidence-based programs that are available that that you can implement, or that if you're partnering with mental health in your schools, to make sure that the practices that you're spending your resources and time with are evidence-based. So that's one reason that we wanted to be able to provide you with that list of practices, because what we sometimes see is practices that, like the students getting counseling. Well, counseling in its generic form is sort of random, so we don't know whether that's going to end up being effective or not. In fact, in the research, just generalized counseling is not effective for individuals with anxiety. So we have the evidence-based list for you, and we also have, if you have any other questions, you can type them in for us there, but I also wanted to remind you that we have also our archive chats there on our homepage. So you can go to our webpage and scroll down and see all the chats. This one will be there and the other ones. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.